It was through the word that you found your salvation. And that gave you three things. Now, I'm sure you know at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, now abideth faith, hope, and love. But that trinity of Christian virtues goes all the way through Scripture. They all use it. Faith is primarily relating you to what God has done in the past. Hope relates you to what he's going to do in the future. And love relates you to what he's doing in the present. But faith, hope, and love are the three dimensions of your individual salvation. The trouble is today, faith, hope, and love abide, but of these the most neglected is hope. And that's a tragedy. And that's why I made the video, The Final Facts, because I find as I move around the country, the future is not being talked about. It's all the kingdom now. It's all here and now. It's all how to live in the kingdom now, how to have your marriage in the kingdom now and your business in the kingdom now. And so there's been very little talk about heaven and hell and the return of Christ and the day of judgment in many new fellowships. So we made that video to try and restore this dimension of hope, because hope is an anchor. That's the symbol of hope. It's an anchor that holds you when the storm comes, when you know how it's all going to end. That holds you firm when you're in crisis. When the storm hits you, if your anchor's down and your hope is sure, and you know that Jesus is coming back for us, you can face anything. But we've been so concentrating on faith and love that we haven't been teaching people how to hope. And 1 Peter is the epistle of hope. He concentrates on hope in both his letters more than faith and love. But what he says is, God has given you a living hope by the resurrection from the dead. Even if they kill you, death won't touch you. You've got a living hope for the future, and the hope of a new body and a new life beyond the grave. You can face death if you know that. A friend of mine was held up by a mugger in Sydney, Australia, with a knife. And the man was going to plunge the knife into his chest if he didn't give him all his money. And my friend just said, "You can't frighten me." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because if you stick that knife in me, you just rush me to heaven, and I'm longing to go there." And he really meant it. And the mugger dropped the knife, and he led him to the Lord. What an instinctive reaction. But you see, his hope was so certain. Another man I know, a Methodist headmaster, a burglar broke into his house and held him up at gunpoint in his study, across the desk. And that friend just said, "Whatever brought you to this, my friend?" His whole concern was for the man. And again, he led the man to the Lord. See, when your hope is sure, it's quite a challenge, isn't it? When your hope is sure, even death doesn't. They just rush you into the presence of the Lord. Mind you, to balance up, I must tell you about Herbert Silverwood. Any of you heard that name? He was a pub comedian who became an evangelist, and he used to go to Yarmouth. And on the promenade, he used to preach on the front. You knew him too. And one day they persuaded him to go in swimming in the water, and he hated swimming, but he donned an old pair of Bermuda shorts or some really outlandish garment, and they took him in. He couldn't swim, but the sea shelved rather steeply, and they hadn't realized that. And he got out of his depths, and he's splashing around and yelling for help, and the lifeguard pulled him out and pumped him dry. The lifeguard said, "Mr. Silverwood, I don't understand you. I've heard you preaching about heaven all this week and how much you long to go there. First chance you get to go," he said, "you're yelling for me to pull you back again." Now, Herbert Silverwood hadn't been a pub comedian for nothing. And he just looked down, he said, "Would you go like this?" But knowing Herbert Silverwood, he really did long to go. Do you know the real difference between a Christian who's got hope for the future and one who hasn't? A Christian who hasn't is willing to depart and be with Christ, but wanting to stay here. But a Christian with real hope wants to go, but is willing to stay. See? Now remember the last letter I wrote to David Watson. I just shared that with him. And it made quite a difference to him. He mentions it in his little autobiography, Fear No Evil. And it was, David, are you willing to go but wanting to stay, or wanting to stay, wanting to go but willing to stay? And Paul said, I'm wanting to depart. But if he wants me to stay around here a bit longer, I'm willing to stay. Quite a difference, isn't it? That's why that man in Beaconsfield said, come and see how a Christian dies. Eager for off. Well, that's hope.